Um, Thank you for Mr. Omar is coming to the privacy talk. It was very pleased to having a discussion with you, the privacy experts. So today's privacy talk is about the very informative sessions in order to make sure what the privacy protection will go in the futures. So, Ms. Sommer, please introduce yourself to the listeners.
Thank you, Kohei-san. A pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me. My name is Omer Tene. I'm from Israel. I used to be a law professor there. 7 years ago, I joined the IAPP, International Association of Privacy Professionals, where I serve as the Chief Knowledge Officer. I'm also a senior fellow at the Future of Privacy Forum, which is a think tank based in Washington, D.C., and still have a couple of academic appointments.
Yeah, sounds good. Great introductions. So let me look into about the IAPP. So what is the purpose of these organizations at the privacy protection space?
So the IAPP, again, International Association of Privacy Professionals, is a nonprofit, non-policy professional association. A nonprofit, as you probably know, is a type of corporate structure in the US, essentially an entity that doesn't have owners. Non-policy means we don't advocate or lobby for any of the substantive privacy issues. And the reason is that as a professional association, we have members who come from all industries and governments, regulators, academics, really from all walks of privacy life. We have 55,000 members all over the world. Some of them are lawyers. A minority of them actually are lawyers, about 35%. Others are in IT or in governance management functions. I said we don't lobby or advocate. What we do is we provide training. We have certification programs for privacy professionals. We have large events, which of course are not taking place in person these days because of the pandemic, but typically we have about a dozen events every year, some of them very large. We have publications and research and really a community of people who work in this space who meet pretty much every day of the year in different parts of the world to discuss issues connected with privacy.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. I saw that your activity on the IAPP, which has been a very great thing. So you also have some experiences to discuss with the Japanese government, the BPC, that's the Data Protection Commissioner in Japan. So that was pretty amazing. So you said that you're working on as a chief knowledge officer, which is a very unique positions, I think, in the global community. So how do you work as this role in the IAPP?
Yeah, thank you. And that's a good question because you're correct. It's not a very common title. I actually started at the IPP, as I said, 7 years ago, as vice president for research and education. And over the years, the IAPP expanded and my role also expanded. So when I joined, we had about 8,000 members. Now we have 55,000. We were about 50 or 60 employees. Now we are about 250. So the organization grew significantly, and with it, my responsibilities grew. So at some point, we changed the title. What I'm actually in charge of as Chief Knowledge Officer is the knowledge, the content, the privacy expertise within the IAPP. And specifically, that includes responsibility for our research team, our publications team, our programming team for events. So if you think of an event, it has a content element, the program, but it also has a lot of logistics and, you know, the business side. So I don't do that. I focus on the program.
Mm-hmm.
And also external affairs, so the relationships with governments. You mentioned the PPC and other data protection authorities and government institutions all over the world. So that is the role of a chief knowledge officer, at least at the IAPP.
I see. Yeah, I haven't heard about the chief knowledge officer before, so that was a very interesting position. And also, the other organization can replicate the same things to increase the awareness and also the knowledge spreading to the communities, which is a very excellent job.
Thank you.
Yeah, so let's move on to the next questions. So recently, I'm just checking American controversials, right, in data protections. So the many things that happens in between the private companies and the government. So my next question is, in the United States, isn't in like try to enact it the maybe just the federal level of the data protection law in this pandemic situations. So how do you envision this kind of the federal laws will be enacted after all with these situations?
Yes, so as you probably know, the US doesn't have an across-the-board comprehensive privacy protection law like Europe does with the GDPR, or Japan with its own Privacy Protection Act. Instead, the US still regulates privacy sector by sector. There are a lot of different pieces of federal legislation applying to health privacy, to financial privacy. That's HIPAA and GLBA, the Fair Credit Reporting Act. There is FERPA, which applies to students' privacy. There is VPPA, which applies to privacy in the video watching context. So a lot of federal laws. There are also a lot of state laws that apply. For example, every state in America now has a security breach notification law. And I'm sure you've heard of CCPA, the major California privacy legislation that came into force in January this year. So with that approach, the US actually has a couple of bills now from both sides of the aisle. So one from Republicans in Senate, one from Democrats in Senate and in the House, that try to regulate specifically privacy in the COVID-19 pandemic context. The reason is that HIPAA, the healthcare privacy law in the US, doesn't necessarily apply to all of the situations that arise with respect to pandemic mitigation. HIPAA, for example, only applies to certain covered entities, which are essentially healthcare providers, healthcare insurers, but not to companies outside the core of the healthcare system. And if you think of, for example, the discussion of contact tracing apps, which are relevant now in times of pandemic, for example, Google and Apple, as you surely know, launched a major initiative, a platform, an API for proximity tracking. That kind of data is not covered by HIPAA. So there are a couple of bills currently, as I said, in Senate and in the House. As is often the case over the past few years, there is some distance between the Republicans' version and the Democrats' version. What might actually help this specific law go through is the fact that it might be attached to one of the stimulus packages.
Mm-hmm.
So the US government put in place very large stimulus financial packages to try to save the economy. The Federal Reserve Bank and the US government pumped trillions of dollars actually into the economy to try to boost it at this very difficult time. There will likely be another package, another stimulus package in the next couple of months, and this COVID privacy legislation may be attached to it, and then chances are it can pass. So that's where we stand in the US on that.
I see. Yeah, that's very interesting part of it, because in Japan it's been a very similar talk. The privacy commissioner is enacted a new law in this year. We try to improve the updated the 3 year terms, because the privacy law is been a very quick and fast to change the situation of the data economy. So that's why the government is trying to change their mind. But so far, we haven't decided any specific rule for the government data protection, which is very important to protect the consumers and users, human rights as well as the data protections. We have to check the updates within it. Besides, I guess, the government, the many tech companies try to align the data protection rules, such as in Facebook. I saw that some news there in a settlement with the FTC for the big punishment. It's enormous numbers it was, but actually they are in agreement. So what does it mean, this agreement? I guess the Facebook is trying to align the compliances, the requirement the FTC is in enforcement right now. So what is the signal through this opportunity is that?
Yes, so obviously the FTC settlement with Facebook was incredibly important because, as you said, Facebook agreed to a very significant fine, a fine in an amount of $5 billion, which even for a large and profitable company like Facebook does mean something. The context of the case is the well-known Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal, and the FTC alleged that in those practices that led to Cambridge Analytica's usage of Facebook users' data, Facebook actually violated a previous settlement that it agreed to with the FTC a few years ago. And by violating a previous settlement, the FTC was able to impose a very significant fine. It's important to note that it's not just a monetary fine. As part of the settlement, Facebook also agreed to some structural changes, and specifically changes that we haven't seen before as sort of standard market practice. These were new. So, for example, creating a committee of independent directors on the board of directors, which will deal with and oversee privacy and data security, reporting to this committee, frequent audits by a third-party auditor, and such. On the one hand, this was a very significant action and settlement, and by orders of magnitude, the largest fine ever imposed in the context of privacy. I think the largest fine in Europe, just for comparison, is still the $50 million that the CNIL, the French regulator, imposed on Google. So that's what 100. 1% of $5 billion. But at the same time, critics were thinking and saying that maybe even this was not enough, because for companies like Facebook that have, you know, an incredibly profitable business and just a huge revenue stream based on the monetization of individuals' personal data, um, critics thought that Facebook can write off the $5 billion and move on. And we're arguing that the settlement didn't actually change the underlying business practices. Another line of criticism was that Facebook CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, didn't have to actually account for the failings of the company individually, personally, himself. So that's something to think about. On the one hand, a very significant case and very large penalty. On the other hand, Facebook still continues with its business model. So critics think maybe even this isn't enough.
I see. That's the point that we need to watching regarding the tech giants moves. So I think the like some other company like Google's Apple is also the one of the very important nodes that they developed the COVID-19 technologies for the healthcare authority. The Japanese government also they choose their technologies for the integration of the assistant into the public services. So what do you think like their purpose to making a try this kind of approach, as well as what point we need to pay attention with the technologies from the public or government perspective?
Yeah, so the Apple Google partnership here, the initiative is obviously very important because I think almost 100% of the smartphones in the world use either the iOS or the Android operating system. So by achieving interoperability with respect to proximity tracking between these two systems, Google and Apple are essentially enabling applications for proximity tracking to work seamlessly all over the world. It's important to realize that Google and Apple aren't actually launching or creating a contact tracing application. They're just providing the infrastructure for such an application to work, because otherwise, without this initiative, contact tracing applications would just be blocked at the operating system level, which requires very granular consents and agreements in order to access, for example, location data or operate Bluetooth in the background. So what they're really doing is opening up the capability for others to create the contact tracing applications. I think on the whole, the architecture that they created is very privacy protective. It's based, first of all, on a hard opt-in, so people have to agree to download the contact tracing app. It's based on proximity as opposed to geolocation. Collection of geolocation is very sensitive from a privacy point of view, because if I know someone's location, I know where they live and where they work, and you know, if they visit a doctor or a religious priest, and I know a lot about them. In order to trace contacts with a COVID-19 patient, you don't actually need to know their whereabouts, their location. It's enough to know that someone was close enough to a patient. The system defines it as less than 6 feet, for a period of time of more than 15 minutes, and then you can assume that they've been exposed to the virus. So it doesn't matter, if you think of me as the patient and you as someone who crossed paths with me, it doesn't matter if we did it in a swimming pool or in a concert hall or in the workplace. It's enough to know that we were in close proximity to each other and that now you've been exposed. The system is also decentralized, so it doesn't maintain a central database with all of the data. And of course, for privacy and data security purposes, it's always more protective to have a decentralized architecture where information is just kept on individuals' phones and not actually shared in some massive database that has a lot of people's data. So I think from a privacy point of view, it's a promising structure. Frankly, I think the bigger questions are, will people adopt contact tracing applications? I think we still haven't seen them voluntarily adopted at a very large scale. There have been attempts in Korea, in Singapore, in Israel, where I'm from, but the adoption rate has never been very high. And another problem is accuracy. With any large system, and this system included, you have false positives and false negatives. That means that people can be alerted that they've been exposed to the virus even if they haven't been. For example, Bluetooth signals travel through walls. So if you live in an apartment building, someone on the floor upstairs may have the virus. You're not exposed because you never are in the same room with them, but your Bluetooth signal might still notify you that you've been in proximity to a patient. If people get a lot of notifications like this, they might lose trust in the system and just not believe the notifications or not adopt it, get rid of the app. So that threatens the effectiveness of contact tracing applications.
Yeah, thank you. There are many countries is try to choose contact tracing the technologies to help the save the pandemic, then it's in to get the recovery as normal. So I am personally like like exploring this in American states is not adopting the contact tracing app. I guess I saw that some news just the 3 states is in adopting the technology, like the North Dakota and the South and Utah's, but the others is not. So is there any reasons why the American states is not choosing a contact tracing for the solutions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you know, of course, that the American response to the virus leaves a lot to be desired. It has been very fragmented and, hasn't been very effective. We just crossed, unfortunately, 100,000 deaths yesterday or the day before. Part of the issue is that it is a state-by-state response. And this means that you have 50 states and they might pursue different policies. I think more states will join the fray, and I do think this will gain traction. Because for now, the past couple of months, we've basically been locked down. And when people are locked down and not going to work in offices, there isn't much use for contact tracing because it's typically the only people you see are your family members. If you're exposed, it's typically in the grocery store, and it's a very minimal contacts. I think as the economy reopens and people go back to work, then it becomes a very urgent issue, because inevitably the virus won't be completely eradicated. We will still have cases, and it will be incredibly important to test and trace. The US has just been very slow out of the gate. Our testing capacity hasn't been nearly as impressive as Korea, for example. I don't know about Japan and where, how it's doing in terms of testing. But without testing, you can't really have contact tracing, because contact tracing requires the initial identification of someone who's actually infected. So the bottom line is that I think with time we will see these systems used more. I'm still not sure they will reach critical mass. I think as long as they're voluntary, that's a big, challenge to try to get people to download something like this, especially if it drains their battery, for example. I think people might be more concerned with that than with their privacy even. But I do think it will spread beyond the 3 states that you mentioned: Utah, North Dakota, and South Dakota.
Yeah, thank you. So that's the very natural information for us. We haven't imagined that Japan has started to consider the tracing application. It's almost started in the early of the June, but now the government is just disclose the basic architectures, how it will be works. I guess it seems to be a data protected, based on the architecture of the Apple and Google services. So yeah, we have to see how we can get the recovery. So the move to the next question is about the data protection landscape. I had a talk yesterday with my friend. He's working at this space in experts. He said it's a data protection is a move to the statement level in the companies. So they need to make the cultures privacy preserving. They need to make the disclosures, accountabilities announcement to the external stakeholding. So when it comes to the American company, any signal that change the internal management and compliance system since we started the data protection law?
Yeah, so the IAPP, my organization, actually does an annual survey where we go out to our members. We typically get about 1,000 responses, and we check the answers to these questions that you just posed. What are companies doing in order to manage data in the organization? How do they build a privacy program? How do they staff it? What are the budgets? What are the responsibilities? Who reports to whom? Which tools they're using? This report is free, and you can Google it and get it on our website. It's called IAPP EY governance report, and the last one was from 2019. So I refer, the people who are watching it to that. But I'll say that the US is pretty advanced when it comes to operationalizing privacy requirements. And interestingly, in the US, the privacy profession and the field wasn't really motivated by regulation like it was in Europe. So it's not GDPR that created the privacy compliance field in the US, although it certainly expanded it and grew it. But it was more a recognition from companies initially in the tech industry, but then much broader than that, really any industry now, healthcare and financial and retail, that data is a very important asset, but also presents risks and liabilities. And what companies are doing, I think the first stage is to realize and recognize this, that you need to manage privacy in the organization, create a privacy program, appoint someone to oversee it. In the US, we call it the Chief Privacy Officer, a CPO. In Europe, of course, they refer to it as the Data Protection Officer, the DPO. And then there are, I'm not breaking new ground by saying that this entails doing data mapping and data classification and vendor management. So making sure your relationships with other vendors or with customers, you're not compromising data and privacy. Data minimization, trying to limit the amount of data that you collect or retain and store. Consent management has become important with GDPR and CCPA actually. So making sure that you're getting consumers to agree when they have the right to agree to different things. Responding to subject requests, so to access requests or rectification, deletion, the right to be forgotten. So it's all those things, but I think initially it's creating a privacy management program.
Yeah, interestingly, a lot of tech startups is coming from the United States. Even the data protection law is coming from Europe. I had a talk with some startups in Europe. They said the American startup is taking a share, they're taking a market. Of course, the investment is coming from US. So they are jealous to how the European startups can the beating it together. So that's a very interesting. The US is coming from there. So from the last question, it's a message asking for you that's to the Asian or Japanese companies. So what kind of message you have from the data protection landscape?
So I don't know so much about the Asian because it's just such a large,
Okay.
area and field, and there are very little similarities, of course, between China or Korea and
Sure.
Japan. But speaking specifically about the Japanese industry, Japan obviously has a tremendously powerful economy. It's the third largest economy in the world. It has very close business ties with both the US and the European Union. Of course, with the EU, you now have the mutual adequacy arrangement in the data protection space. And specifically, the Japanese tech sector has always been world leading. So you have some tremendously powerful companies. I don't want to insult anyone by not mentioning, but of course, Sony and Panasonic and Rakuten and many others. So I think it's important for Japanese businesses, certainly businesses that operate on the global stage and that are multinationals, but even I would assume businesses that are sort of medium-sized enterprises that operate just in Japan to address this field, to recognize that privacy is a growth area because data is just so cardinal and critical for many organizations. And then to go through some of the steps that I mentioned and that you can see every privacy talk, mentions these steps by appointing someone to the role who is qualified, is trained, knows something about privacy and data protection, not just in Japan, but also in the rest of the world.
Yeah, thank you. That's the very great message. I think it's a time to to sharing the knowledge and experiences in the global level because we have a different privacy protection laws granularly, so that we have to take an initiative, go together. So thank you for having a great presentation, Mr. Omar. Let's keep it up and keep it in touch. So yeah, thank you for having a appreciate it again.
Thank you very much, and I hope sometime soon in Tokyo also.
Sure. Thank you.